Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas. And his Catholic faith is day 43. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 83 and 84, the prima pars, that is, on free will, and how the soul, while united to the body, understands corporeal things beneath it. The translation that I now always use is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether man has free will. I would like to ask, before we ask if man has free will, if man has translated Aquinas' Latin correctly in this article. And although I have always seen this article translated as free will in the English and the Latin, Aquinas uses the phrase libero arbitrio, which can mean free will for sure, but can also mean free choice. And I'm almost certain, and maybe you'll agree with me by the end of this episode, that Aquinas more likely intended to mean the latter. Does man have free will? St. Thomas responds, man has free will, otherwise counsels, exhortations, commands, prohibitions, rewards, and punishments would be in vain. Which is, as an aside, its own evidence for the soul, that the entirety of humankind, always and everywhere, has just taken it for granted, that the human mind is not determined by physical laws or material, a universal assumption, kind of like the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason, that there is just no chance of us being wrong about. And if you are to encounter someone someday who denies these things, know for sure that the burden of proof is on them. And until they have conclusively disproved the certainty or the existence of any of these things just named, the existence of the soul, the certainty of the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of sufficient reason, then there will be no reason to entertain any doubt concerning any of them. 2 other components of this article worthy of discussion would be the definition of free will, according to St. Thomas, and how it is related to God's universal causality. Beginning with the first, Aquinas writes, but because man's judgment, in the case of some particular act, is not from a natural instinct, but from some act of comparison in the reason, therefore he acts from free judgment and retains the power of being inclined to various things. Therefore, in such matters, the judgment of reason may follow opposite courses and is not determined to one, for as much as man is rational, is it necessary that man have a free will. What we mean by free will is that the will is not determined by instinct, nor determined by some material necessity in any way, but that it follows the judgment of the mind, the intellect. And since the intellect is entirely immaterial, then it is free, and so is the will which follows it. And how does this work out with the certainty of God's providence, his universal causality? St. Thomas writes, God therefore is the first cause, who moves causes both natural and voluntary, and just as by moving natural causes he does not prevent their acts being natural, so by moving voluntary causes he does not deprive their actions of being voluntary, but rather is he the cause of this very thing in them, for he operates in each thing according to its own nature. So when I move my hand, that action for sure must find its ultimate origin in God. That was discussed in episode 2 on the 5 proofs for God. But because God acts by giving being and actuality to my intellect and my will, he does not coerce them, he enables them, and he enables me to act in precisely that manner in which he made me to act, which is voluntarily. As St. Thomas will say, interpreting the verse in Jeremiah, which reads, the way of a man is not his, neither is it in a man to walk. St. Thomas will say, man's way is said not to be his in the execution of his choice, wherein he may be impeded whether he will or not. The choice itself, however, is in us, but presupposes the help of God. Article 2, whether free will is a power. The things man can do, his faculties or powers, such as the power to see, hear, think, as we have learned, are distinguished by their objects, color, sound, the essence of things. So does free will have its own distinguished object and therefore can be considered its own distinct power? Aquinas will say a couple articles from now, no, free will is not a distinct faculty apart from the will. But what we should take away from this article is why free choice or free judgment is a better translation than free will. And the reason for that is that the will is necessarily inclined to happiness, like a triangle necessarily has three sides. But it is free in the choice of the means to that end, as St. Thomas says. Although free will, liberum arbitrium, i.e. free judgment, in its strict sense denotes an act, in the common manner of speaking we call free will that which is the principle of the act by which man judges freely. Those things which we are naturally inclined are not subject to free will, as we have said, of the desire of happiness. But the free will is indifferent to good and evil choice. Article 3, whether free will is an appetitive power. We have the apprehensive powers like sight, touch, taste of the sensual faculties and understanding, an intellectual faculty. We also have appetitive faculties. We desire, we fear, we enjoy. And the sensual faculties, we also will, which is an intellectual faculty. So, in what category does free will fall in? St. Thomas responds, we say that we have a free will because we can take one thing while refusing another, and this is to choose. The reason of this is because the proper object of choice is the means to the end, and this as such is in the nature of that good which is called useful. Wherefore, since good as such is the object of the appetite, it follows that choice is principally an act of the appetitive power, and thus free will is an appetitive power. Article 4, whether free will is a power distinct from the will. St. John Damascene says free will is nothing else than the will. St. Thomas writes, on the part of the appetite, to will implies the simple appetite for something, wherefore the will is said to regard the end, which is desired for itself, but to choose is to desire something for the sake of obtaining something else, wherefore, properly speaking, it regards the means to the end, wherefore it belongs to the same power to will and to choose. And on this account, the will and the free will are not two powers, but one. And on to question 84, how the soul, while united to the body, understands corporeal things beneath it. Article 1, whether the soul knows bodies through the intellect. Let us begin with St. Thomas's conclusion. He says, we conclude that through the intellect the soul knows bodies by a knowledge which is immaterial, universal, and necessary. And for the crash course on how that works, see episodes 41, episode 7. Here we can say that the soul knows what a dog is, what a cat is, what a human being is, through what Aquinas calls a knowledge that is universal. A knowledge that is not of the particular dog or cat, but of the overarching idea in them, the form or the essence of dog or cat. We abstract the general species or form of things from the particulars, and this is how the soul knows material things, through the intellect, which was the question of this article. Article 2, whether the soul understands corporeal things through its essence. We have said in previous episodes that the soul comes into the world as a blank slate. The blind man does not know blue because he cannot see it. And even the man who can know blue will not know it until he actually sees it. And then by comparison with the other colors can draw out the general essence of it. We do not know corporeal things simply by existing as a human being via our essence, which is what this article is asking. This can only be true of God. In St. Thomas's words, If there be an intellect which knows all things by its essence, then its essence must needs have all things in itself immaterially. Now this is proper to God, that his essence comprise all things immaterially as effects pre-exist virtually in their cause. God alone, therefore, understands all things through his essence, but neither the human soul nor the angels can do so. Article 3, whether the soul understands all things through innate species. Do we know what a cat is? Because at the first moment of our existence, the idea of it was placed in the mind? No, as Aristotle said, the intellect is a tablet on which nothing is written. The two arguments Aquinas will give for this position is first, that we do have to learn things in order to know them. Secondly, since a human being is a body-soul composite, it would be strange to think that the body would be in no way part of how we come to understand things, and even stranger to consider the body a hindrance to such activity. Therefore, we must say, as Aquinas has been saying for a while now, that we receive the knowledge of things through the senses and then through abstraction, and not because of any innate ideas in us. In St. Thomas's words, now we observe that man sometimes is only a potential knower, both as to sense and as to intellect, and he is reduced from such potential to act through the action of sensible objects on his senses by instruction or discovery to the act of understanding. Wherefore, we must say that the cognitive soul is in potentiality both to the images which are the principles of sensing and to those which are the principles of understanding. For this reason, Aristotle held that the intellect by which the soul understands has no innate species, but is at first in potentiality to all such species. Article 4, whether the intelligible species are derived by the soul from certain separate forms. Do you understand what a dog is because you derived it from some immaterial existing in itself somewhere out there in the ether idea of dogness? And the answer is no, but this is what Plato, who is a very well-known and respected thinker, thought, so St. Thomas probably feels like he needs to respond to that thought here. And so St. Thomas is very thorough in this question, but gives a concise response in the following words. If this were true, we should not need the senses in order to understand, and this is proved to be false, especially from the fact that if a man be wanting in a sense, he cannot have any knowledge of the sensibles corresponding to that sense. As we have said, the blind man does not know blue. Article 5, whether the intellectual soul knows material things in the eternal types. Do we know what a dog is by seeing the idea of it in the mind of God, in seeing what God had in mind when he made the dog? In one way, we have to say no, because we do not see God's essence. We do not see God as he is, and therefore we do not see all things in him, like one can see everything in the mirror by seeing the mirror. See episode 7 for more on that. But in another way, we do know material things through the divine, because first of all, we are apprehending the same form of things out here that are also in God, just in a more simple and exemplary way. And secondly, because the light or activity of the active intellect by which we are able to abstract these intelligible things is, according to St. Thomas, a participation in that uncreated light, which is God. In his words, we might say that we see in the Son what we see by the Son, and thus we must needs say that the human soul knows all things in the eternal types, since by participation of these types we know all things. For the intellectual light itself, which is in us, is nothing else than a participated likeness of that uncreated light, in which are contained the eternal types. Article 6, whether intellectual knowledge is derived from sensible things. Do we know what a dog is because of the knowledge derived from seeing the dog? And the answer is yes, but the distinctions encompassed in that process are worth drawing out, beginning with St. Thomas's conclusion. On the part of the phantasms, intellectual knowledge is caused by the senses. But since the phantasms cannot of themselves affect the passive intellect and require to be made actually intelligible by the active intellect, it cannot be said that sensible knowledge is the total and perfect cause of intellectual knowledge, but rather that it is in a way the material cause. So material things cannot affect an entirely immaterial thing. One cannot push an angel, for example. In the same way, if the mind, the intellect, which is entirely immaterial, is going to be affected by the senses, it will have to itself reach into the sensual world in order to interact with it. This reaching into the material world in order to abstract the intelligible form or essence from some particular sensed thing in the imagination, what we call the phantasm, is the work of the active intellect. As a review of that process, first we see dogs with our eyes. Then we see them in the mind via the imagination, the picture of which, or mental word, we use to represent it, we call the phantasm. Then from that phantasm, which is either again an imagined image or a mental word, the entirely immaterial active intellect draws out the essence from it and then actualizes our potential intellect in the act of understanding. And if that sounded unfamiliar or it's still a little hazy, feel free to run back to episodes 41 and 7 again. But the answer to our article is yes, we do derive our knowledge from sensible things. Article 7, whether the intellect can actually understand through the intelligible species of which it is possessed without turning to the phantasms. Can you think about dogs without either mentioning the word dog or some other word pointing to it, either vocally or in your head, or without an image of some dog, again, either before your eyes or in your head? And the answer is no. We do have to conjure up some sensible sign of the thing we want to think about before we can think about it. Just try thinking about dogs without saying or seeing anything, not even in the imagination, that has to do with dogs. And we can't. To think about the nature of dogs or the nature of anything, we have to have some sensible particular image or word to abstract the nature from. Not just the first time we learn the thing, but whenever we want to think about it. As Aristotle said, the soul understands nothing without a phantasm. And in the words of St. Thomas, now we apprehend the individual through the senses and the imagination, and therefore, for the intellect to understand actually its proper object, it must of necessity turn to the phantasms in order to perceive the universal nature existing in the individual. Wherefore it is clear that for the intellect to understand actually, not only when it acquires fresh knowledge, but also when it applies knowledge already acquired, there is need for the act of the imagination and of the other powers. Article 8 in our last article, whether the judgment of the intellect is hindered through suspension of the sensitive powers. St. Thomas says, what a man does while asleep against the moral law is not imputed to him as a sin, as Augustine says, but this would not be the case if man, while asleep, had free use of his reason and intellect. Therefore, the judgment of the intellect is hindered by suspension of the senses. I would also point to what intoxication does to the judgment of the intellect, since alcohol and many other substances clearly impair the powers of sense, internal and external, and through that also impair judgment. But when it comes to sleep, St. Thomas says, what is happening is a suspension of the common sense, which is probably the most difficult internal sense often to wrap our heads around. And so here is Aquinas and a helpful footnote from the Gilby Summa. Aquinas says, while asleep, a man may judge that what he sees is a dream, discerning, as it were, between things and their images. Nevertheless, the common sense remains partly suspended. And therefore, although it discriminates some images from the reality, yet it is always deceived in some particular. And a footnote from the Gilby Summa says, the common sense is the faculty of waking judgment about the real. Pavlov's dog salivates at the sound of a bell because he has a sense power enabling him to connect one sensation with another and to connect both with its felt needs. This is what we said in episode 40. The common sense is the sense pulling the senses into one sensual experience. Then the Gilby Summa continues on sleep. It says, sleep is the act of shutting off the common sense or sense consciousness. Kind of interesting to think about. And in response to our article, we must say, for all these reasons mentioned, that the judgment of the intellect is hindered by the suspension of the sensitive powers. Which brings us to a close for questions 83 and 84 of the Prima Pars, that is, on free will, and how the soul, while united to the body, understands corporeal things beneath it. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.